Greetings! In this episode, we're going to be painting a Tyranid Dominatrix in the style of the 1997 box art here at Bunker 6. The Dominatrix is a white metal 5-piece model, as you can see here. Prior to assembly, I highly recommend just giving the model a wash in warm soapy water, letting the model dry, and then you'll be able to move on to the assembly and painting steps next. I'm using 2-part epoxy to fill up any gaps that I think look too big and noticeable on the model. Thankfully there weren't too many. And once I was finished with the filling with epoxy, I then moved on to priming the model. This model is made up of generally dark colours apart from the bone sections, so I primed the model in black. I sadly couldn't find a tutorial for how to paint this model exactly like the original, so it's all trial and error, but hopefully it'll look good in the end. Once that initial blue base was finished drying, I moved on to the bone sections and plate sections that were dotted all around the Dominatrix. The blue hide and the bone plates take up a majority of the model, so it's very important that I found a good mid-tone to work with, so doing highlights and shading were easier down the road. Now there are some areas that had blue overspray while using my airbrush. I thought it'd be quicker to just block those back out in black again, rather than doing a masking process at the beginning. I then moved on to painting the scaly sections under the neck and tail plates. These are also intermittently found in the arms as well. And once again, it's just a mid-tone for this base coat. Nothing too bright and nothing too dark. A quick way of adding some vibe to your paint job quite early on is doing some shading. So that's what I'm just doing across the plate sections here right now, making sure that I pull the paint towards the crevices and making sure the edges where there isn't a joint have the least amount of wash. As you can see, I'm pushing everything up into the areas where I would expect them to be the darkest. Now to create a little bit of uniformity between the light and dark blue of the scales and the hide, I'm using the same wash for both. In this instance, it's Drakenhof Nightshade. Very dark and rich, but also quite dirty blue wash. And it seemed to pull everything together quite nicely. And as an aside, you won't see this in the video, but once I finished one stage, I made sure to immediately repeat it on the other side of the model too. I wasn't particularly happy with the light and dark contrast yet with the initial wash that I added to the plates, so I added an even darker one, being cognizant of the fact that I still wanted that dark wash to be mainly focused in the joint section once again. Most of my base coats have been a mid-tone per se, but in this instance with the veins, they were quite dark and sickly, so I decided to go with a darker pink as my initial base coat / mid-tone. There wasn't going to be too many highlights on these veins apart from where the veins met each other, so apart from that, it was fine going quite dark. The shade made things even darker still, but that was completely fine given the context. This next section is all about glazing. I'm making sure that I'm pulling the red paint away from the black because we want to make it look like it's transitioning from the black. Now of course black to red is quite an extreme transition in terms of colors, so we just have to really take our time and make sure that we're patient. Otherwise things can start to look unrealistic very quickly. And when mistakes were made, I wouldn't just rely on the red to fix the problem, I actually would then go back to the black and create a glazing of the black and pull it from the red back into the black section to create a transition with the black instead of the red, basically making the glazing process happen in reverse. I then did my classic trick of adding this red Vallejo air paint over my initial red base, which really makes reds pop. I then started adding some of the red highlights just towards the tips and the uppermost edges of the horns to really make them expressive. As you can see, the brush isn't too loaded up, but just enough paint so it pulls at the very tip where I want it to be the brightest point. And just to make these horns as close to the reference image as possible, I'm finishing off with a very fine layer of orange, and things are looking really vibrant now. Now we're going to be highlighting the plates and bone sections. A common thing to do is actually go back in with your initial base color, which is what I'm doing here. Now I'm not covering all of the plates, as you can see. I'm starting at the midway point on most of them and pulling up towards the edges. That's because we still want to maintain the shades that we've already added in the previous stages. And this is actually a bit of blending and a bit of glazing. There's way too much paint on my brush for it to be glazing, but really I'm just trying to get as many pigments as possible to the edges where I think they should be, without really taking too much away from the shading we've done earlier. Now this step might seem kind of strange, why am I adding a yellow glaze over these bones, but if you look at the original reference image, there seems to be a yellow tinge to these plates and bones, so I thought I'd give it a try. But I made sure that I didn't stain the ivory/khaki layer we just added previously, but instead made sure the yellow pooled around the middle of all the plates and was pulled back towards the brown and darker sections. In order for that yellow to be a little less obnoxious and in your face, I'm going to be using a yellowy brown, in this case Seraphim Sepia, to pull those colors together again, making sure the Seraphim Sepia is still going into all the same nooks and crannies where the Agrax Earthshade was before, not sitting any of that yellowy brown on these sections that we still want to keep bright. The Seraphim Sepia really helped get the transition going from the yellow back to the browns, but I wasn't completely satisfied, so I went in with a darker color, but in this case we went with Army Painter Soft Tone. This is quite different from the Games Workshop washes in terms of its texture, but its opacity made the transition work perfectly. The story so far with the bones and plate sections is trying to get the mid-tones down to the shaded sections as smooth as possible, for my painting standards anyway at least. But now we're going to be addressing the highlights of these sections. It's going to be very simple because I'm already quite happy with the transition from the darkest points to the mid-tones. The yellow that we added is carrying us up into the highlights quite nicely, so I think just an edge highlight of ivory should do the job just fine. I then decided to move on to highlighting the blue hide sections. This is very simple because the sculpt is absolutely fantastic. It makes it very obvious where these pronounced edges are. Now personally, I've covered about 90% of the edges that I've found with this particular blue where it was required. Now you don't necessarily need to do that, but if you do a reduced amount of this particular blue, make sure it's still on the most raised areas because you are going to be adding additional blue highlights over the top of this blue as well. And you will want those next highlights to still make sense with the previous highlights that you've done. And those type of future highlights that I'm talking about are happening here. You just want to go into the highest areas, but you still want to be pulling this new brighter highlight away from the previous layer that you've done. If this bright highlight is kind of coming out of nowhere, it's just not going to sit right and look unrealistic. If you're pulling it from that previous darker blue layer, it's going to have a much smoother transition and be much more pleasing to the eye. Now we're going to be adding an even more extreme and smaller highlight. You can see I'm just pulling it into all the sharpest corners and the highest points where I feel it is necessary. You may also notice in the bone plate section that some ridges have been added, and all that is me striking the paintbrush with an ivory paint. It's basically an extension of the edge highlighting. It's being pulled from the middle of the plate down towards the edge multiple times with a size 0 brush. I then moved on to painting the pipes green that lead up to the bioweapon cannon sitting atop the Dominatrix, all the while making sure that I leave some black underneath as the final darkest point of contrast for these pipes. Once I finished the green base coat, I moved on to the first highlight, being very sure that the highlight sat in the middle of the pipe on each stroke, just to make sure it looked like the pipe's highest point was right where that lighter green was sitting. And I do recommend something like a size 0 brush for doing these smaller highlights. These pipes in the reference material looked very vibrant, so I knew one color that I could add over the top of that green highlight was a tiny amount of yellow. So I'm just adding a very small pinprick of yellow on each of the ridges of these pipes. The highlighting of the veins was the next task that I took on. This was pretty simple. It was a combination of edge highlighting where necessary and a tiny amount of glazing too. The junctions where the veins converged was generally where I wanted the brightest points to be, and those junctions would be highlighted even further in the next step. I used a pretty watered down pale pink for this final highlight on the veins. It's watered down because I wanted it to soak in and have a quite natural transition to the previous layers. I then moved on to painting the first highlight for the scales. I made sure to keep a majority of the paint towards the top of the scales because that's where I wanted the highlight to be the most predominant. I kept focusing on that area which I wanted to be most predominant up towards the top of the scales, but in a brighter blue this time for the next highlight. I did about half the amount of painting on the scale as the previous layer, so I had something to transition into. This next highlight is where I'm really trying to push the highlights as much as possible, really focusing in on the top 10% of the surface area for each scale. As you can see, the highlight paint has run in places between the scales. I'll just go back in with some black paint later to tidy that up. I finally turned my attention to the purple sections. In this case, it's these two wings and the cradle-like object at the top of the Dominatrix model. We're going to be doing the exact same painting process as we did with the red horns. We obviously have a black color, and that black color has to be transitioned into a much brighter color. The way that we're going to be doing this is watering down our bright color, in this case purple, and pulling it in the opposite direction away from where we want to still keep the black paint. It's kind of like glazing, but we've got a lot more pigment on our brush than say a glaze would normally have. Now, I wasn't particularly happy with the lack of smoothness between the transition from the black and to the purple, so in order to make that a little bit smoother, I'm using what's called a filter technique, or it's kind of like a glazing technique, I suppose, where I'm going to be pulling a purple wash over the purple back into the black section, just to try and trick the eye to make those transitions from my previous work look a little bit smoother. This is an interesting one for me, blending red and purple together. I've never really had to do anything like that, but I assume that if I just use the same glazing techniques as I've used so far with blending the black to the red and the black to the purple, things should work out probably okay. And even if there are mistakes, I can hopefully do some additional glazing with some washes to try and smooth out any of the errors. But as you can see, I'm just making sure that I pull the red mostly towards the edge of where I want the paint to be its most predominant, and waiting for it to dry, and then doing another coat after that. Once that was finished, I was kind of dissatisfied with how dull and flat the red looked, so I grabbed my Vallejo Model Air Red and just put it straight over the top to make things way more vibrant than they were previously. This is a trick that I do a lot of times to make my reds way more vibrant than they normally would be. At this point, I was very satisfied with how the red and purple and black were transitioning with each other, so I moved on to bumping up the brightness of the red on the very edge of this wing section with pink glazed layers. It's the exact same process we've been going through with the red and the purple glazed layers, but all we're doing is less surface area coverage. Maybe have less water on your brush than I have in this shot, but if you just take your time, everything should go fine. When that all dried, I felt I was very happy with how the transition across that wing was sitting compared to the reference material, and so I moved on to doing some rather chunky edge highlighting. Now, you don't need to be this imprecise, but I just felt on an instincts level that I wanted to still emulate the fleshiness that this wing evokes, so I kept the edge highlighting pretty rough and ready rather than having the precision of, say, edge highlighting Primaris armor. Once the wings were finished, I moved my attention back to the purple sections of the cradle. Now I'm just doing the same exact process I was doing with the bone and plate sections, where I'm creating these artificial ridge textures by making sure that I pull strokes of the paint towards the edge away from the middle of the plate, as you can see here. And I highly recommend doing these sort of strokes with a 1 or a 0 size brush. Once that preliminary highlight was finished, I moved on to the next highlight that was required for these purple sections. I'm focusing in on corners and sharp edges, rather than creating too many ridges like I was doing with the previous layer, because this highlight is supposed to accentuate much smaller parts, more extreme parts of this section of purple. And by extreme, I just mean areas which would logically catch the most light on these parts that I'm working on. Let's now move our attention to the hoof-like exoskeleton armor plating parts that are around the feet and leg sections. All I'm going to be doing here is my usual trick of a bluey-grey transition highlight from black rather than a classic black-grey-white transition in highlighting black. I'm not a big fan of going from black to grey to white. For some reason, I prefer doing bluey greys and then lighter bluey greys all the way up to white. It just seems to be a little bit more aesthetically pleasing to me. but each to their own. You can do these exact same steps, but using grays instead of bluey grays like I'm doing here. And once again, this is a very similar process as we've been doing with the majority of this model. Any areas that require being brighter, we're making sure that we're pulling a majority of that brighter paint towards a conclusion or a final point where the brush stroke ends, which we want to be the brightest point. That's how we get those smooth transitions from one color to another. The glazing continues where I'm pulling my brush towards the most extreme edge, which I want to be the brightest point on the particular part that I'm working on, as you can see here. One secret weapon when it comes to glazing is kitchen towel. Once you've got the correct consistency of paint on your brush from your wet palette, it's very important that you dab or roll off your brush onto a kitchen towel just to pull off some of the moisture that's still sitting on the brush. This will give you a lot more control and also reduce the risk of coffee staining when you're trying to do the glazing process. The last stage that needs addressing on these leg and feet armor plating sections is the flash highlight. Now, a flash highlight's a little bit different from an edge highlight. It might not be a term that's used very often, but I use it to describe a type of highlight that is really almost like a pinprick of paint, rather than a continuous line of paint. Now, you can do a little line of paint that's leading up to a flash, but it's almost like a ball of light that's reflective rather than a consistent edge highlight that you'd normally expect to see on regular, say, Space Marine armor or something like that. The scales of the neck, underbelly, and tail had a slightly cooler bluey grey finish to them, but I wanted the scales on the legs and arms to have a bit more of a baby blue, electric blue finish to them. That's why I'm painting them with a slightly different process. This is the same process as the initial scales that we were painting, where I'm just doing a new highlight, but this time instead of pulling the paint towards the top of the scale, I'm trying to pull it towards the middle. At this point, the model has been finished in terms of its painting. I just now need to focus on assembling the base of this model. Now, this is a classic GW slotter base, as they call them. Now, as you can see, there's a little bit of overhang underneath the base. I will be filing that down, as you can see. Try and wear a respirator if you're filing anything like white metal, because it does contain lead, I think. As you probably noticed in that last shot, there are still some gaps left over on the slotter base, as the miniature itself doesn't have a long enough base to completely fill the slot. I will solve this problem by using a small piece of Plasstruct plastic. This type of plastic is normally used in scale model railway settings, and I'm using the Plasstruct glue here to bond it to the base. They're made of a similar material, so they do work together. This very, very thin glue dries very quickly and is basically invisible once it's dried. The fact that this piece of plastic is not sitting flush with the base isn't too much of a concern, because we're going to be covering the entire base in a gel-based superglue. Aside from the fact that this gel-based superglue is very thick, the type of material that we're placing over the top of the superglue will make seeing these panels pretty much impossible. And once the panels are fully cured onto the base, you can just cut away the excess like I'm doing here with an X-Acto blade. Now, I don't like to cover my entire model in glue straight off the bat when it comes to basing. I'd rather do a little section by a little section, just gives you a bit more control. I also don't want to get glue on my fingers and then inadvertently touch the model, because there's too much glue all over the place. So I'm doing one little section, filling everything in, waiting for that to dry, and then doing another little section until the base is full. I waited for the glue to completely cure, which was about 4 to 5 hours. I didn't want to risk any of that glue getting on my paintbrush, even a cheap one like this, because I don't want to have to replace a brush if I don't have to. I'm using some very, very cheap Liquitex acrylic paint here. I'm just thinning it down ever so slightly, just so it can get into all the nooks and crannies, and I'll do a couple of coats of this. You don't necessarily need to thin it down, but I think it works a little bit better if you do. I'm now picking out some of the large rocks, which are the first thing that I actually glued to the base, with a lighter brown, as you can see here. And once that stage is finished, I'll move on to highlighting the rocks even further. I made sure that every large rock would get an edge highlight from this next stage that I'm doing, but I also used this same color in patches around the base to create a little bit of texture and a little bit of variation, so not everything has a uniform finish to it. And then my final highlight that I'm doing here, which is with Terminatus stone, and this is the dry brush variant of the paint. I'm just carefully dotting this around the base once again, not trying to be too uniform, keeping things sporadic so it has a bit more of a natural finish. And talking of natural finishes, I realized that the Terminatus stone was looking a bit unnaturally bright in a few places, so I went back in with this khaki color just to bring things down a little bit in terms of contrast. And to add even more contrast, this time not in the highlights, but in the shades, I decided to do some washing around the clusters of larger stones, as you can see here. Now I could have covered the entire base in this wash, but I decided it would be more emphatic if I did it in just a few places, once again to also achieve this idea of contrast. If everything looks too uniform, things will start to feel unnatural. Now I'm clipping a tiny section out of this tuft because it's going to be slotted in and around a very small piece of metal, which is underneath the raised foot of the Dominatrix. I'm assuming that this part was there because of the casting process of when this model was made, but I can't be entirely sure. I didn't feel comfortable painting it any particular way, so I decided to cover it in a tuft. I also didn't feel comfortable cutting it away because I wanted as much structure as possible. Now I'm just using some wood glue here and there and adding some static grass over the top of it. Due to this being a Tyranid, I wasn't too concerned about accuracy of scale or anything like that. This Tyranid is probably on an alien planet somewhere, therefore we have alien grass. Now because of the weight of this model, I didn't have a way of holding this model apart from at the base as you're seeing here. That's why the base hasn't been painted prior to the varnishing stage, but I will varnish the Steel Legion drab rim after I finish painting it here. And when everything is dry, this model is complete. And there we are, the Tyranid Dominatrix. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to paint one of your own Dominatrix, you can pick up a copy of the 3rd edition Battles book that came in the box set for Epic 40k, and it's got a really nice picture in there that you can reference. Obviously it's only one side of the Dominatrix, but I'm sure the other side pretty much looks the same. And of course you can always use my video now as a reference too. If you enjoyed this episode and you are new to the channel, please consider subscribing and give the video a thumbs up as well. Much appreciated, and until next time, I'm Vince, signing off from here at BUYMEACOFFEE.